He boarded the plane quietly, carrying only a small leather bag and a laptop. The cabin was mostly empty, and he chose a window seat in the middle. The hum of the engines and the murmur of passengers settling in created a calm atmosphere. He opened his laptop, intending to catch up on emails and work during the flight. Across the aisle, a woman settled into her seat. She was loud and immediately noticed him. At first, it was subtle: a glance, a smirk, a whisper aimed at a nearby passenger. He ignored it, focusing on his work. He had dealt with rude people before and knew not to react. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, she muttered small comments under her breath, making him the subject of her attention. Once, she made a remark about his clothing, questioning why someone like him would be on this flight. He looked up briefly, maintaining a calm, neutral expression before returning to his work. She leaned slightly toward him, trying to provoke a response. The murmurs around them grew as nearby passengers noticed the tension. He stayed composed, typing and occasionally adjusting his headphones. Her remarks grew louder, commenting on his accent and appearance. She aimed to humiliate him. Some passengers began whispering to each other, unsure whether to intervene. He remained calm, taking slow breaths and responding politely whenever necessary. When she asked a condescending question about seating, he answered clearly, showing no anger. This frustrated her further, drawing more attention. She invaded his personal space, leaning over. He met her gaze steadily for a brief moment, silently warning her that he would not be shaken, and then returned to his laptop. Passengers whispered and glanced around, some recording the encounter discreetly. She seemed aware that people were watching. Making her gestures exaggerated and desperate, he adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, focused on a document. His calmness contrasted with her chaotic energy, demonstrating a quiet authority. Minutes passed and she continued her loud comments. Flight attendants tried to intervene politely, but she dismissed them as joking. He ignored her, maintaining composure. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. One elderly man whispered to his wife about the behavior. A young woman discreetly recorded the exchange. Around him, passengers sensed that he was in control. He briefly closed his laptop, meeting the eyes of those watching, silently showing his confidence. The woman seemed momentarily taken aback, trying to mask it with a forced laugh. By cruising altitude, the initial shock had passed. The woman was quieter, but still glancing at him. He resumed work, calm and professional. Passengers noticed, sensing that there was more to him than they could see. Tension lingered, with an unspoken anticipation that something significant was quietly unfolding. Even if no one knew what it was yet, he could feel the tension in the cabin rising as the flight continued. The woman across the aisle had grown bolder, louder, and more insulting. Her eyes constantly flicked toward him, full of disdain, and her voice carried just enough for nearby passengers to hear her taunts. She made remarks about his appearance, his choice of clothing, and even his mannerisms. Some of her words were so sharp they made passengers around her uncomfortable. Whispers and sideways glances started to spread throughout the cabin. People were noticing, and many were quietly judging her behavior. He didn't react. He kept his posture straight, his hands on his laptop, typing as though the words he entered were the only thing that mattered in the world. The calmness he displayed was magnetic, in a way people couldn't help but watch him, feeling the tension but also admiring his patience. He didn't respond to the woman's insults with anger or frustration. Instead, he let them hang in the air. Allowing her words to reveal more about her than about him, the woman, sensing that he wasn't affected, began to escalate. She leaned across the aisle slightly, raising her voice as if the volume itself could force him to react. She mocked him openly now, drawing laughter from herself and awkward looks from others. She made snide comments about his profession, assuming that he must be someone ordinary or insignificant. She even joked about how she knew he couldn't possibly hold a position of importance. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers with calm authority. There was no anger, no hatred, no reaction she could use as fuel. Just a quiet, steady presence. That look alone seemed to unsettle her slightly. She tried to continue, but there was a subtle hesitation now in her movements. Passengers nearby began to murmur, exchanging looks that said, "This is going too far." Some even reached for their phones, capturing short clips. Not realizing the full story yet, the flight attendants noticed the situation beginning to get out of control. One approached, politely asking if everything was okay. She waved them off, saying she was just joking and that there was no problem. He continued to focus on his work, giving the attendants no reason to intervene further. His composure and polite disregard contrasted sharply with her noisy energy. Drawing more attention from other passengers, minutes felt like hours as the woman continued her taunts. She now made a hand gesture toward him, as if signaling that he should explain himself or react. He didn't. Instead, he slowly closed his laptop for a moment, adjusting his seat. His calm, deliberate movements caught the attention of everyone around. There was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore. Passengers were starting to notice that he wasn't ordinary. Some whispered, speculating about who he might be. He had the demeanor of someone used to being in control, someone whose life experience had taught him how to handle difficult situations without losing composure. He didn't need to shout or fight. His presence alone commanded respect. The woman, frustrated that she was not eliciting any reaction, began to raise her voice further. She made pointed remarks, questioning his intelligence, his social skills, and even his ability to travel alone. Each word she spoke only highlighted her own insecurity in contrast to his unshakable calm. He took slow, steady breaths, letting her words flow past him like water over stone. A few passengers were beginning to intervene quietly. One young man leaned slightly toward the flight attendant and whispered that the woman was making the situation uncomfortable for everyone. The attendants nodded but continued to handle it delicately, aware that confrontation on a plane could escalate quickly. He did not need anyone to defend him. His presence was enough. People could sense his quiet authority, even if they didn't know his full story. The woman noticed the attention shifting. Some passengers were whispering to each other, and a few were openly recording her behavior. She laughed nervously, trying to regain control of the situation, but her energy had changed. The confidence she had shown earlier was replaced by subtle panic. He remained unaffected, calmly looking at his laptop, typing a few notes, and occasionally glancing at the window at one point. She made an exaggerated comment about how someone like him could never succeed in any high-level job. She smirked, expecting him to be flustered, expecting some reaction that would validate her judgment. Instead, he simply looked up, meeting her gaze with a calm and measured expression that said more than words ever could. His eyes communicated something powerful. He was not intimidated, he was not angry, and he certainly was not ordinary. Passengers around them began to feel the tension shift. Where once there was irritation, there was now curiosity. Who was this man? Why was he so calm under such unnecessary provocation? A few people whispered to each other, making guesses, feeling a growing admiration for the way he handled the situation. His silence, his poise, and his measured responses spoke louder than any words could. The woman, sensing that her power over the situation was slipping, became increasingly erratic. Her voice fluctuated, her gestures became more dramatic, and she occasionally slammed her hands on the armrest for emphasis. Every action she took only reinforced the contrast between her agitation and his calm authority. People noticed it. The tension in the cabin had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. Everyone watching could sense that something was about to change. He slowly closed his laptop completely and leaned back in his seat, his posture straight, his expression composed. He let the moment hang, creating a pause that forced everyone, including the woman, to focus on him. The pause was not silent but filled with unspoken weight. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that her words had no effect on him. Her attempts to provoke a reaction had failed completely. A few passengers discreetly began recording again, sensing that this moment was unusual. Others whispered to each other, expressing disbelief that someone could remain so calm in the face of such blatant rudeness. There was a quiet recognition forming among the people nearby. This man was extraordinary in some way. Though they could not yet say how, the woman made one last attempt. Leaning across the aisle and speaking directly to him, her voice sharp and impatient. She asked if he was offended by her behavior, expecting some emotional response. He looked up slowly, his gaze calm, unyielding, and polite all at once. "I am not offended," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Your words say more about you than they do about me." The cabin went quiet. People around them sensed the gravity of the statement. Some nodded slightly, impressed. Others looked at the woman, who suddenly seemed very small and foolish in contrast to his composed demeanor. The power dynamics had shifted. She had tried to intimidate and humiliate, and yet here he remained, unshaken and in complete control. The flight attendants, sensing that the situation had de-escalated, returned to their duties, while passengers continued to watch in fascination. The woman sat back in her seat, her energy spent, unsure of what to do next. Meanwhile, he returned to his laptop, typing a few notes, as if nothing had happened. Yet everyone watching knew that something had happened, something significant, though they could not yet fully grasp it. By this point, the woman had grown quiet, muttering under her breath occasionally, but there was a noticeable shift in her energy. She no longer carried the same loud confidence. She seemed to realize that her attempt to dominate the situation had failed, and that she had misjudged the man across the aisle. Passengers whispered among themselves, exchanging glances filled with admiration for the calm and quiet authority he had displayed. The remainder of the flight continued under a tense but controlled atmosphere. He worked, focused on his laptop, occasionally looking out the window at the clouds passing below. The woman occasionally glanced at him, now quieter and more reserved. Passengers continued to observe, sensing that this man's story was far more interesting than they could have imagined. There was a quiet anticipation building in the cabin. An unspoken question in everyone's mind. Who was this man, and why had he remained so composed under such ridiculous provocation? As the plane continued toward its destination, tension in the cabin began to shift from irritation and discomfort to quiet curiosity and admiration. Passengers who had previously been unsure of how to react now found themselves respecting the man across the aisle, realizing that his calmness and poise were more powerful than any words or actions the woman could throw at him. The story of this flight was far from over, but part two closed with one undeniable truth. He had won the first battle. Not with anger or confrontation, but with quiet, unwavering composure. The woman's frustration had not gone away, even though she had quieted down for a moment. She kept glancing at him across the aisle, her eyes narrowing as if searching for a weakness, anything she could use to provoke a reaction. But he remained calm, composed, and fully in control of himself. His hands rested lightly on his laptop, though he no longer typed, choosing instead to observe the situation calmly. He could sense that the tension was reaching a critical point, and he prepared himself, aware that the woman's behavior might escalate once more. Passengers nearby were whispering among themselves, some exchanging quiet glances, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "She's out of line," one woman whispered to her friend, nodding toward the woman who had been taunting him. Others quietly recorded the scene on their phones, sensing that something unusual and noteworthy was happening. The air inside the cabin was thick with curiosity, and a sense of anticipation grew as people watched. Everyone could feel that the situation was far from ordinary. The woman decided to make another attempt. She leaned across the aisle again, speaking more sharply this time. Her voice carried just enough for several nearby passengers to hear. "Are you really going to just sit there and take it? Aren't you angry? You should be." She smirked, thinking that she had finally caught him off guard. He looked up slowly, meeting her gaze. His eyes were calm but intense, holding a quiet authority that seemed to stop her mid-sentence. "Anger doesn't solve anything," he said softly but clearly, his voice carrying a natural confidence. "And reacting to provocation only gives it power. I choose to remain composed." The cabin went almost silent. Passengers shifted in their seats, clearly impressed. The woman's smirk faltered for the first time, and she hesitated, unsure how to respond. There was a pause, a moment when the air itself seemed charged with tension, and everyone could feel that something important was about to happen. He leaned back slightly in his seat, maintaining eye contact for a moment longer, then returned his attention to the window outside. His calmness contrasted sharply with the woman's rising anxiety. She had been confident, loud, and aggressive, but now her energy was scattered, her control slipping. The passengers around them were no longer just observers. They were beginning to notice the strength of his presence and the quiet power in the way he carried himself. Finally, unable to contain herself, she spoke again. "I bet you're just someone pretending to be important. Probably just another ordinary guy," she said, her tone sharp but uncertain now. She tried to force a laugh, as if masking her own discomfort. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, looking directly at her with unwavering calm. "I am not pretending," he said quietly. "The work I do and the life I lead do not need validation from anyone, especially not from insults or mockery." His words were simple, but their impact was undeniable. The passengers nearby leaned slightly forward in their seats, sensing that this was the moment when the truth, in some form, was about to surface. The woman's face flushed slightly, and she looked away, a flicker of doubt crossing her expression. She had assumed that her words would provoke a reaction, that she could intimidate or humiliate him. But his calmness had done the opposite. It had revealed his strength and left her feeling small, unsure, and unimportant. He paused for a moment, then spoke again, this time with a touch of authority that made even the flight attendants take notice. "It's important to remember that actions and behavior define a person more than words ever could," he said. "Mocking others is a reflection of who you are, not who I am." His tone was measured and even, yet there was an undeniable weight in it. The passengers felt it. The woman felt it. At that moment, one of the nearby passengers whispered to another, "He sounds like someone important. Like someone who really knows how to handle situations like this." Others nodded silently, starting to suspect that he was no ordinary man. The calm he displayed, the wisdom in his words, and the composure in his posture suggested experience and authority that went far beyond what one might expect from a stranger on a plane. The woman, sensing that the attention was shifting, tried one last attempt. She raised her voice again, this time more sharply, demanding to know what he actually did for a living. "You must be hiding something. There's no way you're just an ordinary passenger. Tell me, what do you do?" she demanded. She leaned closer, her face inches from his, expecting a flustered or defensive response. He met her gaze steadily, unshaken. "I work in a field where discipline, strategy, and careful judgment are required," he said. His voice was calm, but carried a quiet authority that made the woman flinch slightly. "I handle situations where composure is more important than anger, where decisions affect more than just myself." The passengers shifted in their seats, some whispering softly to each other, some craning their necks to hear better. The tension in the cabin was palpable. They could sense that the man's life experience and expertise were far beyond what the woman had imagined. Her confidence faltered completely, and she looked around nervously. Realizing that the attention had turned from him to her, he continued, his voice steady and calm. "I have spent my life in positions where patience and restraint were critical, where reacting without thought could have serious consequences. That is why I choose to remain composed now." His words carried an unmistakable hint of his true authority. Though he still had not fully revealed the details of who he was, the woman's lips pressed together in frustration. Her attempts to provoke him had failed completely. She tried to regain control by speaking louder, mocking him again, but her voice now lacked conviction. The passengers around them were no longer just observers. They were allies of his calmness, recognizing the strength it took to endure the provocation without losing composure. A few passengers quietly leaned toward each other, whispering, "He must be someone important. Look at how he handles this." Their admiration was clear, their curiosity growing. The man's quiet demeanor and composed responses had shifted the energy of the entire cabin. What had started as an uncomfortable scene had now turned into something extraordinary. A demonstration of restraint and strength under pressure. The woman, realizing that her usual tactics had no effect, began to panic internally. She had misjudged him completely. Her insults, her mockery, her aggressive posture, all had failed to provoke even the slightest hint of anger. The calmness he displayed was unshakable, almost magnetic, and it left her feeling powerless. He leaned slightly forward, speaking again, his voice carrying just enough for the passengers nearby to hear. True strength is measured by how one remains composed in the face of provocation, not by how loudly one can speak, or how aggressively one can act. His words were simple, but carried immense weight. The passengers nodded quietly to themselves, absorbing the wisdom in his statement. By now, the woman had grown silent. Her energy had completely shifted. She no longer seemed confident or aggressive. Instead, she appeared small, uneasy, and uncertain, as though the weight of her own behavior had finally caught up with her. The passengers continued to watch, sensing that the moment of revelation was approaching. Though they could not yet predict what would come next, he returned his attention to his laptop, opening it and typing briefly. But there was a subtle intensity in his eyes that suggested he was ready for whatever might happen next. The cabin was quiet now, filled with anticipation. Everyone could sense that this man was extraordinary, though his true identity remained hidden. The woman had no idea what she was dealing with. And the passengers were about to witness something that would completely change their perception of him. Time seemed to stretch as the plane continued toward its destination. The woman occasionally muttered under her breath, but she no longer had the energy or confidence to continue her attacks. The passengers whispered among themselves, curious, intrigued, and clearly impressed by the man across the aisle. They could see that he had handled the situation with dignity, restraint, and intelligence. Leaving the woman embarrassed and powerless, he closed his laptop completely. Leaning back in his seat and looked around the cabin with calm authority, his posture, his expression, and the quiet confidence he exuded left a lasting impression on everyone nearby. The woman's attempts to provoke him had failed entirely, and the passengers were beginning to understand that he was far more than an ordinary traveler. The tension in the cabin had shifted completely. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had transformed into a lesson in composure, strength, and dignity. The woman's behavior had revealed her own insecurities. While his calm responses had revealed the power of patience and self-control, passengers now watched with curiosity and admiration, eager to see what would happen next, as if they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. And in that moment, though no one yet knew the full truth, it was clear that the man across the aisle was someone of significance. The calm, measured way he had handled the entire situation had set the stage for a revelation that would leave everyone stunned. A revelation that would completely upend the assumptions of the woman who had tried so hard to provoke him. The story was far from over, but part 3 closed with one undeniable fact. The man's composure and quiet authority had begun to reveal his true power. Even before he spoke his full story, the woman had quieted down, but her eyes still darted nervously toward him across the aisle. She had expected to intimidate him, to draw a reaction that would satisfy her, but nothing had worked. Instead, the man remained calm, composed, and seemingly untouchable. Passengers around them were beginning to sense that something extraordinary was happening. They whispered among themselves, glancing between the two, trying to guess who he might be and why he carried himself with such confidence. The man closed his laptop completely and leaned back, his gaze scanning the cabin. There was a subtle awareness in his eyes, a quiet observation of the passengers around him. He seemed to notice everything, the murmurs, the stares, the whispers, and even the woman's forced attempts at composure. But he did not let it distract him. He was fully in control of the situation, and that control only seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. Finally, the woman could no longer contain her curiosity. She leaned slightly closer and demanded, her voice almost trembling, "Who are you? What do you do? You can't be ordinary, I can tell. Tell me." Her tone was a mix of frustration, curiosity, and lingering arrogance. She thought she had cornered him, that her boldness would force a revelation. He looked at her calmly, his expression unreadable, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried a weight that made everyone in the row pay attention. "I do what few people are prepared to do," he said. "I handle situations where decisions can change lives. where discipline and precision matter more than anger or noise, where composure is not just a choice, but a necessity. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, intrigued by his words. A few whispered to each other, clearly impressed. "Who is he?" one asked quietly. "He doesn't sound ordinary at all." Another passenger nodded, recording the moment discreetly on their phone. The energy in the cabin shifted. What had started as tension and discomfort was now curiosity and fascination. The woman's confident posture faltered. Her lips pressed together tightly, and her hands fidgeted on the armrest. She had expected a defensive reaction, an apology, or even anger, but this was far from what she anticipated. He had not only ignored her insults, but had responded in a way that commanded respect and attention. Seeing an opening, he continued, his tone calm and deliberate. "I have spent years in positions where failure was not an option, where every action mattered and every decision had consequences. I have trained to remain calm when others would panic. I have learned to assess situations carefully and act only when necessary." His words were precise and measured, painting a picture of a man whose life had been shaped by discipline, skill, and responsibility. The woman's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. She realized that her assumptions about him had been completely wrong. Passengers around them were now paying full attention, sensing the growing tension and the emerging revelation. The woman's energy had shifted entirely. Her confidence had evaporated, leaving only nervousness and uncertainty. Then, a small but significant clue about his identity emerged. One of the passengers, an older man who had been watching quietly, whispered to his companion, "I think he might be someone from the military, or maybe a highly trained security professional. Look at how he handles everything without a single sign of fear." Others nodded, realizing that his calm demeanor and measured responses suggested experience and expertise far beyond the ordinary. The woman, sensing the shift in attention, tried to regain control. "You're hiding something," she said, almost accusingly. "You can't expect me to believe you're just calm because of experience. Who are you really?" Her voice had lost its earlier arrogance. It was now tinged with uncertainty. He looked at her, his calm gaze unwavering. "My identity is not a secret, but it is not something I broadcast to satisfy curiosity or ego," he said. "What matters is not the titles I hold, but the choices I make and how I handle challenges. And right now, I am choosing to handle this situation with dignity, as I have done countless times before." The cabin was silent, except for the hum of the engines. Passengers were leaning forward, trying to catch every word. The energy had shifted completely. What had started as a conflict had transformed into a display of authority and composure. The woman's eyes widened slightly as she realized the depth of the man's character and the power he carried without raising his voice. Then, without warning, he allowed a small reveal. He reached into his bag and pulled out a briefcase, opening it carefully to reveal documents, credentials, and a badge that indicated a high-ranking position in a specialized field. It was subtle, but enough to make nearby passengers notice. The woman gasped softly, her eyes widening as she realized that he was indeed someone of significance. Flight attendant noticed the movement and glanced over. The documents and badge were clearly official. Passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity now turning into awe. The man's quiet authority, his composure, and the way he had handled the woman's provocation now made perfect sense. He was not ordinary. He was someone who had trained for situations just like this, someone whose experience had prepared him to face provocation without losing control. The woman's mouth opened, but no words came out. She had been so confident, so sure of herself, yet here she was, confronted with a truth that completely dismantled her assumptions. Her arrogance had been replaced by shock and disbelief. She looked around nervously, aware of the passengers' attention and their growing respect for the man across the aisle. He closed the briefcase calmly and looked at her again, his expression neutral but firm. "It is always better to treat others with respect," he said. "Assumptions and insults only reflect poorly on the one who makes them. I have chosen to remain composed because it is the right thing to do, not because I am afraid or intimidated." His voice was quiet, measured, and full of authority. Every word reinforced the image of a man who had lived a life of discipline, training, and responsibility. The woman slumped slightly in her seat, her earlier bravado gone. Passengers around them were murmuring, expressing admiration for the way he had handled the entire encounter. They could see that his calmness and quiet authority were far more powerful than any volume, insult, or aggression the woman had displayed. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely, from tension and hostility to respect and fascination. One passenger whispered to another, "I can't believe how calm he is. He's like a real-life hero or something." Another nodded, eyes wide. The woman's embarrassment was clear. She had underestimated him completely. She had taunted, mocked, and tried to provoke, only to realize that she was no match for his calm, steady presence. The man leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, then opened them again and looked around the cabin. His posture, his expression, and his quiet authority made it clear that he had emerged victorious without a single aggressive word or action. The woman's attempts to dominate and humiliate had failed entirely. For a moment, the cabin was filled with an unspoken acknowledgement. This man was extraordinary. His composure, skill, and quiet authority were undeniable. The woman, realizing this fully, looked down at her hands, her face flushed with shame. She had been confronted not with anger, but with dignity, patience, and a quiet power she could not match. Passengers whispered quietly, some recording the moment discreetly, others just observing in awe. The man's full identity was still not entirely known to everyone, but the hints were enough to shift the dynamic completely. The woman had been exposed, and the passengers now understood that appearances could be deceiving. Someone who seemed ordinary at first glance could hold incredible strength, skill, and authority beneath the surface. The man returned his briefcase to his bag, closing it carefully. He did not gloat, he did not raise his voice, and he did not seek attention. He simply sat back, calm and composed, allowing the moment to speak for itself. The woman remained silent, her energy drained, her arrogance replaced by humility and shame. Passengers looked on, recognizing the lesson in front of them. True strength is quiet, composed, and often invisible until tested. The plane continued its journey, and the atmosphere had changed completely. The woman no longer made a sound, and passengers whispered among themselves, admiring the man's composure. He had handled the confrontation with skill, patience, and dignity, revealing just enough to make his authority clear without needing to boast or show off. The cabin was filled with quiet awe, respect, and curiosity, as everyone sensed that the full story of his identity and power was only just beginning to unfold in that moment. It was clear the man across the aisle had emerged victorious in a battle of character and composure. The woman's attempts to provoke had failed completely, and the passengers around them had witnessed a display of true authority and dignity. The revelation had begun. The next steps would only confirm what everyone had already started to sense, that he was someone extraordinary. Someone whose calm, strength, and skill commanded respect, and someone whose story was far more remarkable than anyone on the plane could have imagined. The plane was slowly beginning its descent, and the tension that had filled the cabin earlier had transformed into a quiet curiosity. Passengers were still whispering among themselves, some glancing discreetly at the man across the aisle, others watching the woman whose arrogance had been replaced with visible discomfort. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely. The confrontation that had begun as a simple act of provocation had grown into a lesson in composure, patience, and dignity. He remained calm, sitting upright with a serene expression. His briefcase was securely at his side, but the aura he carried told everyone around him that he was far more than just a traveler on a plane. Passengers exchanged glances, murmuring softly to one another about the extraordinary presence he projected. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, argue, or defend himself aggressively. His quiet authority spoke louder than any words the woman had thrown at him. The woman, seated across the aisle, still struggled to process what had just happened. Her previous confidence had evaporated entirely, leaving her with a sense of shame and disbelief. She kept her eyes down most of the time, occasionally sneaking a glance at him, unsure if she should apologize, retreat, or try to regain some semblance of dignity. Her energy had been completely drained by the encounter. Passengers nearby could sense the shift in her demeanor, a stark contrast to the calm strength of the man who had handled the situation with effortless control. One passenger, a young man seated nearby, whispered to his companion, "He's incredible. I've never seen anyone stay so calm under pressure." His friend nodded, clearly impressed, and others began nodding quietly in agreement. Even the flight attendants noticed, exchanging subtle looks that communicated their admiration. The man had taught a lesson in restraint and authority, and it was clear that the passengers had absorbed it. The woman, finally unable to contain herself, muttered something under her breath. It was a low, uncertain comment, a mixture of frustration and awe. She had realized, finally, that she had underestimated him completely. All her assumptions about who he was and what he could handle had been wrong. She had expected to provoke a reaction, to dominate him with her words and presence, but instead she had been exposed, left powerless in the face of his quiet authority. Then came the moment that confirmed what many passengers had already begun to suspect. As the plane prepared for landing, he reached once more into his briefcase and retrieved an official badge and identification documents. He held them briefly, just enough for passengers seated nearby to notice the emblem and the credentials. The reactions were immediate. Gasps, wide eyes, and murmurs filled the cabin. The realization hit Hea was not just calm by nature. He was trained, highly experienced, and had a position that required extraordinary skill, discipline, and authority. The woman's face went pale. Her eyes widened as she caught a glimpse of the badge, recognizing the level of authority it represented. She had been so confident in her assumptions, so certain that she could provoke and humiliate him. Now, confronted with the truth, she was speechless. She could not meet his gaze. The arrogance that had carried her through the initial confrontation had crumbled completely. He placed the badge back in his briefcase and looked around the cabin with calm eyes. There was no need for further explanation. His presence, his words, and his composure had spoken for themselves. The passengers, now fully aware of his extraordinary position, quietly acknowledged his authority. Some whispered in admiration, others recorded discreetly, but all had a sense that they had witnessed something exceptional. The woman, seated across the aisle, finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain. I didn't realize," she began, but trailed off. Her usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a mix of embarrassment and newfound respect. The man nodded slightly, acknowledging her words without gloating or harshness. His calm demeanor remained unchanged, demonstrating that true authority did not require humiliation or pride, it only required patience, wisdom, and composure. Passengers around them continued to whisper, their curiosity now fully focused on him. They speculated quietly about his career, the skills he must possess, and the situations he had faced in life that allowed him to remain so composed under such direct provocation. The cabin was filled with admiration and awe, a stark contrast to the tension and discomfort that had characterized the earlier part of the flight. The flight attendants, observing quietly, nodded to each other. They had seen difficult situations before, but few with such a clear demonstration of calm authority and control. The man had handled the encounter perfectly, ensuring no conflict escalated, no one was harmed, and every passenger had witnessed a display of discipline and poise. The plane touched down smoothly, and as the passengers prepared to disembark, many found themselves glancing one last time at the man across the aisle. His composure had not wavered once. The woman, still seated, lowered her head, reflecting on the lesson she had learned, that arrogance and provocation cannot undermine true authority, and that appearances can be deceiving. As the doors opened and passengers began to leave, whispers of admiration followed him. People who had been seated nearby quietly commented on the calm, the wisdom, and the presence he had shown throughout the flight. Even those who had not been directly involved in the earlier confrontation had sensed the energy in the cabin and were struck by the impression he left behind. The woman remained seated until almost the last moment, finally standing with her head slightly lowered. She offered a hesitant, almost imperceptible nod toward him, a silent acknowledgement of her misjudgment and the respect she now felt. He nodded back, his calm authority unchanged, reinforcing the lesson of dignity and restraint without needing to speak further. As passengers filed off the plane, many looked back, still whispering about what they had witnessed. It was not just the confrontation that had been remarkable, it was how he had handled it. His calm, measured presence had completely shifted the energy of the cabin, turning what could have been an uncomfortable, tense flight into a quiet lesson in composure, authority, and human dignity. The woman, walking away, reflected on her behavior. She realized that her assumptions, her provocation, and her arrogance had led to her own humiliation. She had underestimated someone whose life experience, discipline, and composure far surpassed her expectations. The encounter left her humbled, a stark contrast to the confidence she had displayed earlier. Meanwhile, passengers continued to talk quietly among themselves, expressing admiration for the man across the aisle. "I can't believe how calm he stayed," one whispered. "He didn't even raise his voice," another nodded, adding, "In the way he revealed his identity, just enough for us to realize he's extraordinary." Incredible. The energy in the cabin had transformed into awe and respect, a testament to the quiet power of patience and authority. As the plane emptied and the man prepared to leave, he did so with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the flight. No one could mistake the lesson he had imparted, that true strength is quiet, steady, and composed. He did not need to assert dominance or humiliate anyone to demonstrate his authority. His presence alone had been enough to reveal the depth of his character and skill. Passengers left with a sense of having witnessed something rare. It was not a story of conflict, anger, or aggression. It was a story of discipline, composure, and wisdom. The woman, too, left with a realization that arrogance and provocation cannot overpower true authority, and that humility often follows lessons learned in unexpected moments. The man, calm as ever, walked off the plane, leaving behind an atmosphere transformed. He had handled the confrontation perfectly, revealing his authority without hostility and teaching a silent lesson about strength, patience, and dignity. The passengers would remember the encounter for a long time, not for the woman's provocation, but for the extraordinary presence, composure, and quiet power of the man across the aisle. In the end, the story concluded with clarity. True authority does not need to shout, provoke, or fight. It is measured by patience, wisdom, and the quiet confidence to face provocation without losing composure. The man had shown this fully, leaving everyone on the plane with a lasting impression of respect, awe, and a deep understanding of what it means to handle life's challenges with dignity.